Test, test, test. Looks like audio. Get one. All right, this is policing. Looks like we're about what is that? 6 minutes out. Policing. 6 minutes out. So if you're watching this after the fact, feel free to move forward by 6 minutes when we start class. Oh, stuff upstairs. Just letting this my first class today. Reboot. What the hell is this?
Morning.
Good morning. 4 hours. Snooze. People in the waiting room. Add. All right. So here we are. For background spotlight. Yay. All right. So here we are. Policing. All right. Well, I get everything up. Tell me what's going on in the world.
The truth is, there are super nice people over there too. In northern Michigan, it's just like a wonder. It's incredible. And none of you deserve your leaders. None of you. I don't care. It's true. Even the people.
All right. So stuff that's going on in the world. Of course, it's always a crazy world out there. But I haven't really been paying too much attention to it myself. See, really here. Need to check on PowerPoint. It has been cooking with gas. We can. Let's see here. Open up downloads. This is Walker Cats. See, that did not put that where I thought it would. Let's bring that over here. Okay, so we're talking about that. Let's see where the PowerPoint was. Okay. All right, so we probably need to start. Where did we leave off at? Boom. Chat. Politics are heating up. Yeah, politics are always heating up. That's one of those things it's always really, really crazy to see because it's always a good metric to see just how wide people's views are in terms of I guess what you'd say is acceptable behavior because it's it's like listening to music. I've gotten in a different class where I ask people the favorite bands kind of thing. It's like, you know, if you ask any one person what other people's choice of music was, yeah, it's like, yeah, same kind of thing with politics. It's always interesting. But yeah, it's heating up and probably not going to cool down. All right, so we were talking about stereotypes last time. I meant to look to see if the video. Ooh, while I'm on it, let's actually pull that up real quick because I started updating some of the class videos and I can't remember if I made it all the way through in here. Nope, I got last week. I still need to post up. So I'll get those out probably in a little bit. But the rest of it should be pretty well squared away. All right, so we had been talking about recruitment changing and some of that kind of stuff. Okay. When we were talking about minimum qualifications, I remember talking about it was like bona fide exceptions to ADA, American Disabilities Act. As we're talking about that, it's like this position is one where, yes, there are very real physical requirements of the job. It's kind of different than most other jobs. It's office jobs, like you don't necessarily have to see, you don't necessarily have to lift stuff. If you're going to do this job, you're necessarily going to have to be fighting somebody maybe at some point, depending on what your specific role is. And so when you start looking at some of those requirements, this one called out to me and I want to talk about it for a second. The height requirement. It says 5'8". It's like, and then portions of the weight. Don't think it talks about this in this chapter, but in between this chapter and history, this is one of the ways that they used to basically keep policing under control in terms of like those who would meet the requirements. If you talk about the political era, it's going to be tied into political affiliation. But once they start moving into professionalism, start becoming more harder metrics, and it's going to be more along things like that. And so if you start moving across time, you'll see those dial back a little bit too. Some of them are still there because they have to be there, but that's going to be there. Okay. High school diploma requirement. When we start getting into actual education, that kind of stuff, start looking at policing in general, find that on average, they have some college background, but it varies wildly. I forget exactly what the average number of hours are across officers, but I think it's something like a 2-year degree. That's science. Stop that. Yeah. Okay, so we talked about residency requirement and that some locations require you to live within their jurisdiction or state within the gang kind of thing. I don't remember if I talked about criminal records. If I didn't, that's one of those ones that is kind of changing because it used to be just a complete disqualifier, particularly for the drug stuff. If you were just notified that you use drugs in some instances, you'd be off the list because society has changed so much. Yeah, that one's dialing back a little bit. Let's see, so it ties in ethical standards and then drug offenses because those are definitely an ethical issue. As well, starting with drugs, all kinds of problems. To heighten officers familiar with the community and the world. That's residency stuff. We talked about that last time. Okay, so changes, minimum standards, constantly changing. It says recruitment incentives, that kind of stuff. So it's no secret that this area is one of the most criticized in society. So that's the way they try to address that. In terms of minimum standards, basically what you'll see there is that some of them have changed in terms of what they ask, not necessarily what's required of you in some ways. I don't know if that's a clear way of putting it. So rather than being something that's going to be tied into someone's physical characteristics or their attributes or that proportion of height, that kind of thing is going to be tied in anyway. Their actual abilities, those tests would be something like a good example would be like push-ups versus here's a weighted dummy that weighs like a person. You have to carry it so far so fast. Okay, that makes a whole lot more sense than I can do 100 push-ups. It's like, yeah, if you can do 100, you got some strength, but Doesn't do anything. Let's see here. Talks about recruitment efforts. We talked a little bit about that. Open recruitment efforts include public advertising opportunities are required by law today. That's going to be in the hiring procedures to get into the HR stuff. Way that they hire, there's going to be requirements for that. Some of those are going to be public postings, types of positions, that kind of stuff. And so for this one, yes, definitely public. Okay. Motivations of police recruits. So to some degree, this is going to talk a little bit about timeline in terms of, I'll talk about it in terms of like overarching field policing. We'll also talk about in terms of career of the individual. And so here's where we'll start to talk a little bit about that. So those who are starting to go into this field, these are the kinds of things that they look to do, right? You're gonna be looking to help, you're gonna be looking for security, safety, that kind of stuff. Fight crime, get some excitement and some notoriety. Of course, that's kind of a double-edged sword, as you watched. I think that was last year, last before I showed you that video. The actual respect that you get when you're on the job may not go in the direction you expect, particularly if you're looking for that. Obstacles. What I'll say about motivations. As we start moving through the career, what happens over time is life. And so there's a few different paths that takes for people. At some point, probably in this chapter, I'll start talking about burnout because it's so common. When we're dealing with the types of jobs that you have to handle here, the amount of work that's involved, burnout is a very, very real thing. First thing is going to talk about are the obstacles, because this is just getting people in the gate. First one's going to be people not meeting qualifications. You have a lot of people who are interested who don't meet it. It's one of those things that's kind of interesting, a little scary. If you think about it too much, it's sort of like the military and IQ standards, right? You start thinking about it, it gets really, really scary. If you don't think about it too much, it makes you feel good. It's like there's minimum standards in place. There are people who don't meet it who want to do the job. Problems with this can be at times depending on the specific needs of an area and availability. And sometimes you'll have those who, didn't make first pass, didn't make second pass, still get in eventually, kind of thing. It's really, there's a will, there's a way sometimes. And so sometimes that'll happen. We should also probably talk about shifting of standards, because that's something that being talked about in society more broadly as we try to open the doors, proverbially speaking, to different people of different types of positions. That's one of the criticisms right there is changing of standards. Because you want people who are going into the field to be as qualified for those who have been doing the job to begin with, but we also want to increase opportunities. So that's a really difficult thing because it's like just cross-reference that with military, that kind of thing. You start looking at their standards and their physical stuff that they do. Of course, they have to have that. And those shifting standards. You see it a little bit over in these areas. It's one of those criticisms. It's the two sides of the coin. Those standards might change, but if they're more reflective of what you do, that's not a bad thing. If they're less reflective or less applicable, that's a problem that needs to be addressed. And so I don't think this book will talk about that in that much detail, but it'll start talking about some of those minimum standards and issues. Applications processes, that's kind of a standard organizational thing. Anytime you're trying to get things processed, that's bureaucracy. It takes time. It just takes time. If you think about it, the application process itself, it's like most people only think about it from their own perspective. That you go in the blind, somebody's going to review it at some point. You don't think about, okay, how many different places is that thing going to go? How many different hands or how many different people have to click a button before it actually gets looked at, kind of thing. And so you think about that and all the potential hangups there. Yeah. Outdated and unreasonable requirements. I don't remember what it has there. I don't know if that's going to tie into like old standards, that kind of stuff. I don't know what exactly that one's tying into. I should remember, but no. Let's see. Testing and selecting applicants. Okay, here's where they're going to start talking about it. The different tests they put you through. Of course, the application is the first one. Can you fill out an application? We start getting into it. Of course, there's the background checks and all that kind of stuff. That's kind of a standard thing you guys are used to. Some of the things you would be used to. Written, physical, and psychological exams. That's fun stuff right there. As it starts getting into that, those psychological exams, if I remember correctly, probably the most expensive element because those are ones that tie into so like certifications, licensure, and all that kind of stuff for that process. So that's one of the most expensive parts of that, if I remember correctly. I want to performance talks about interviews, personal interviews. So depending on what kind of position you're going for, where you're at, its exact setup, it'll change a little bit. But we'll talk about the oral interviews first. It says 45 minutes, standardized interview protocol. That's that way it's standardized across that. It's that kind of thing. So that's one of those things you need to have. So it kind of follows a similar kind of pattern, right? The questions are similar. Realize at this stage, and then there's another one later that we'll talk about that's kind of similar. It's called oral boards, if I'm correct. That would be at some depending on municipality, that kind of thing. You might be before an entire board of people, which might actually include city board members. And whenever that thing's set up, it's actually set up to test you for pressure, that kind of thing. So sometimes they'll put a little bit of a squeeze on you just to see how you handle it. It's like, so these things are not necessarily the what you think of whenever you traditionally think of a job interview. Sometimes these things can be pressurized for a reason. So it's like that kind of stuff.
Oral board when I applied for the Marshal Service.
Mm-hmm. Do they put pressure on you?
I mean, yes and no, a little bit of pressure, but
Yeah.
good. They just asked a whole bunch of questions and
Yeah.
wanted to see how I answered and what I answered and what I knew.
Excellent, professional, but pressurized. That's good. Yeah. And that's exactly it. Let's see. Background investigations, you guys know that kind of stuff, education, employment history. And then, of course, if there's anything else that is not good in there, that'll come out, that kind of stuff. Racism, sexual viewing of restricted information on the internet. I'm really curious as to what they mean by that, because whenever I look at the books, it's like, sometimes those are a little curious. Okay. So, here it starts talking about predicting officer performance. So there's going to be a little bit of this on the bringing people in. And then probably whenever they get through with this, they'll start talking a little bit about burnout and that kind of stuff. So when you start looking at performance and that kind of stuff, you can do analyses on that and predict that kind of stuff. Here, what they do, you just look at the test kind of thing. So if you look at it, recruits will not make good police officers who've been unsuccessful. So sometimes they still get through. Screen doesn't always work keeping up with people who want to do the job but aren't able to for whatever reason. It says pre-existing employment psychological tests do not successfully predict future behavior of a police officer. Yes, that's true. Okay. The best predictor of performance is a person's performance during the probationary period. Okay. So what are they trying to say here? If you're trying to predict officers' behaviors in the course of their career, you cannot do that. It's not a very easy thing. You can do it to a degree, but there's also that individual element in there. You're always going to have those efforts that are unsuccessful where you're going to have errors that slip through. That's criminal justice. Like we were talking about the legal system, how many innocent people are convicted, that kind of thing. Same kind of errors we're dealing with here. We just have to track them. Here, what I like is best predictor performance during that probationary period. Why is that? That's if you're doing it right, that's high oversight, high involvement. That's one of those things that
Well, that's because during usually a probationary period, you got phases.
Yeah.
So, I mean, probationary period, depending on which department you're with, can be anywhere from 3 months to a full year.
Yes, exactly.
And
everything's new.
Normally, the first beginning stage of the probationary period, your FTO is pretty much holding you by the hand because everything you learn in the academy is going to be different from when you actually get to a department. Each department has their own protocols and how they do things. Every training officer is different too, but they're pretty much going to hold your hand, spoon feed you all the information, tell you how they like to do things, how everything likes to be done.
Yeah.
And then the further you get through each phase, the more freedom they give you and the more they just stand back and observe. So they're going to see how much information you're actually retaining and how you're actually interacting with the public, how you're interacting under pressure, all that stuff.
Yeah, think of it like being under the watchful eye of assessment for however long that they deem, and they're going to be paying attention. That's the real thing, because it's not like you're dealing with learning new information, having new types of issues, having to reason, be logical, and try to work with people in all those situations across time is not going to be easy, and that's the real job. That's the real job. And so seeing how people navigate that, it's you get a little bit of ethics, morality, decency, respect, all those things start coming through, and so you see something that's a different picture than what you get here. That's also why they say, what is the phrase? Past behavior is always the best predictor of future behaviors. It's like this one's interesting because it's their first indication of what those behaviors are here. These are just tests to kind of give you an idea. It's not to actually see someone in action, what they do, is it really tell? Okay, achieving diversity is the next one. So this is where it starts to talk a little about that stuff I was talking about last time. So you have equal employment opportunities, that kind of stuff, which is, that's one of those areas it's rapidly changing because the way that it used to be handled versus the way that it's being handled now. I don't want to talk about it really, because that's one that gets really confusing. Basically what it is it's going a whole bunch of different directions. You know, it used to be that the math you could do was sort of like what I outlined last time. That as you're going through the merits of the people who are involved, if you also have that need to meet diversity measures to be reflective of your society, it's like you can take that into account. In some instances, we're seeing it where it's so heavily involved that it's actually limiting recruitment opportunities and even application opportunities, that kind of stuff. Where it's probably had the most issues is probably in higher education related to admissions, that kind of stuff. And so that's one of those things where it's what I mentioned. It is all over the place because in some instances, it's like, yes, you can move with it. Some others, no. That would have been higher education and what was it, the Asian population, if I remember correctly, because they were being their numbers for tests for admission were different than everyone else's because their group was scoring differently. They're trying to adjust that. And so anytime you start messing with diversity, it can be a zero-sum game, the relativistic nature of it, so you have to be careful. Officers from different ground can better able to relate to segments. So this is making that argument here as to why you need that diversity. Because you do. You need to be reflective of your population. You need it to be visible to some degree. I mean, that's the whole reason why we wear a uniform. And so the more aligned we are, the more involved the population is, the more it will naturally reflect the police department will naturally reflect the population. Problem is that's not always what's happening in society. It's not always a good thing. And so we've got a lot of problems that aren't always clearly identified. Let's see. Fronts reflect communities, enjoy better public image. Yes. Employing officers with diversity brings different perspectives. Yes. Law of equal opportunity forbids discrimination employment on basis of race, ethnicity, and gender. And that's where you get into it. So if you're making distinctions on it, it becomes very, very difficult. And that's actually one of the things that I'll mention very briefly here. I don't know if they'll talk about it. It'll be one of the sections we're dealing with policing in society actively, where they'll talk about things like racial discrimination, racial profiling. And then one of the things that they won't talk about is some of the trainings that took place 20 years ago, where it got officers to start paying more attention to race and ethnicity. And what ends up happening as a result is you actually see someone's effect get more pronounced in the wrong direction. So it's like, always be careful whenever you're moving into these areas, because affects moves in all directions, just like people. Okay. Title 7, 1964 Civil Rights Act. This is going to be hiring stuff. Yeah. Failed to refuse to hire, discharge anyone on race, color, religion, sex, national origin. This is one I probably need to familiarize myself with because I'm trying to remember what the list of what would be immutable characteristics would be, that kind of thing, because that's one that's changing right now. I'm trying to remember because if you notice there that there's was it sexual orientation is not included in that list. And as you move, here's what we're talking about bona fide occupation qualifications. But if you notice, it doesn't mention orientation there. And then with the you have sex, it's maybe baked into that, I guess. I don't know. That's one that when you start getting into it, that's a developing area too, because we don't know exactly how we're handling it.
Yeah, because I mean, sex, I mean, that could either, like I said, that could either be for both terms, as in gender and sexual orientation, or it could just mean just gender.
Yeah, or then it becomes the presentation of such. Like, do you appear as one? Are you trying to appear as one? That kind of thing. Yeah. Like one of these categories, and there's many categories. So it gets very, very difficult. And so I don't know how well they've addressed that on the policies side, that kind of thing. Let's see, 1972, equal employment, 1990, Americans with disabilities. And that's where they come up with bona fide occupational qualifications. That's where you get things like, yeah, we're so the ability to walk and lift is required here, that kind of a thing. All right.
Your age to check down.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like the everything with these types of positions. It's like there's a lot of physical aspects to it. Okay. Hiring today. Here's where they're going to talk about the Equal Employment Opportunity Index. So that's one of the ways that they tell whether or not they're meeting their metrics. Remember that this is kind of think back to I think which is talk about old measures. Basically, it came out of World War. And so the very things like response time, that kind of stuff. So there's some limitations there in what you can do with those numbers. You don't get the quality so much. Here, realize that that's going to be one of those things right there as well. It's like you can compare those differences in racial ethnic groups within the composition community it serves. Not always going to get into the cultural element there. There's different areas, different cultures. Even they might have similar demographics depending on how we measure it. Like,
That's like Muskogee Police Department. They're actually pretty diverse.
mm-hmm. Yeah.
They're almost reflective of the community that they serve. Johnny T, he's the police chief. He's Native American. Reggie Cotton, who's the deputy police chief, he's African American. About a third to a little over a third of their officers are African American.
Yeah.
Black. I mean, they've got Hispanic officers, white officers, Native American officers. And
It's also
they've also got a decent amount of female officers compared to other police departments.
Mm-hmm. That means they probably have really good recruiting processes in place. That way they can tap those different populations in the way that they need to. And that's not easy. Let's see. Employment Hispanic officers. Yeah, this is one where society's kind of changing right now too. Because of course you got population, growth, immigration, that kind of stuff. Immigration is one aspect of it, but growth is one that I like to talk about because if you watch growth, that gives you about 20 years out. And so if you look at the population growth across the different demographics here in the last, what's it been, 10, 20 years, something like that, you'll see that it's not really doing the greatest if it weren't for immigration. I think it'd be a negative kind of thing, not even stable, only keeping stable because of that. And if you look at which population is reproducing, there's going to be some shifts there. And so that's one of those things that's changing. Not a bad thing, but just be aware that it's there. Women in policing, women are still underrepresented and have concentration in lower ranks. That's one of those time ordering things to some degree that if you start looking at societal changes and when it's like, well, not just when women entered into policing, because if you get into that, you get into a long history, but like as in terms of larger efforts to increase women's representation here. Employment discrimination suits, or just hiring more African Americans. Now, that's just talking about affirmative action. Basically, whenever you start having the processes for addressing anytime that you're found to be in violation of these practices and procedures, I guess it doesn't get into it, but I think the book gets into it a little bit. Basically, what happens is of course, lawsuits involved. If an organization is found to be in violation, I think the phrase is consent decree. I have to just think about that a little bit more. Basically, what it is, it's almost like a legal contract that's binding that identifies the ways in which they're going to address those types of issues. So if they can do that, and if they don't, there's more remedies down the line, more punishments, that kind of a thing. It's like you'll fix it or it will continue. Okay, so training. Here's where we start talking about training. So academy, field training, in-service training, specialized training, and then immediate training for subsequent. So all the different times of training comes in. Of course, you have everything to get you in there. And then once you're in there, the in-service stuff. If you're not familiar with this, there's a certain number of hours that officers are required to maintain. Would that be the right word to use there? That they have to have every single year kind of thing? Yes. And so you have to show that you're still learning now. And so it's not just the fact that you do the job, that you're going above and beyond to learn additional stuff on the regular. So now that's part of the job.
The one thing that every officer has to do that is always the same is they've always got to do like the mental health training or something like that. That's now required. I think it's like, it's low. It's only like 2 hours, I think.
Yeah.
But
How many hours is it in total there? Because I don't know that off the top of my head.
So
Think-
I'm probably going to be wrong, but I know how much it is for like security officers because we also have to require a certain amount as well.
Yeah.
And for us, it's low. It's only like 8 hours for the whole year.
Okay.
But for police officers, I think it's like 16 to 24.
Yeah, I was thinking it was in the 20s range. That sounds, yeah, okay. That's still, that's quite a bit of time. That's half a week's work kind of thing. It's like, gee. All right. So specialized training for particular assignments, that's going to be specialized. And then, of course, if you ever have any type of issue, that's the standard procedure for how you address it from the organizational side. Some of that's going to be legal liabilities involved with that. That's why they do that. So that way they've got record that they've tried to rehabilitate whatever issue was there to begin with. Let's see what else was there. Challenges to improve training, translating principles and practices taught in training to on-the-job conduct, and then the number of hours. Yeah, so you start dealing with the number of hours it takes versus the efficiency in sending the message and what the message actually does, kind of thing. In here, probably the best example for that is like the discussion of what community-oriented policing is. Because one of these chapters will get into it, and I'll send you some of the stuff from probably the 70s where they were initially started proposing it. And you'll see that what ends up happening is federal government gets involved. Now there's federal funding attached. Now it's everyone's trying to figure out how to get attached to that money. And are they really doing the job? It's like, well, it's people. Just remember we're dealing with people here. It's like some do, some don't. Let's see here. Next up, academy. You already know what academy is. Most people have an idea for what that is. Yeah, seen as a rite of passage, I guess. That's more like the field training stuff. All right, provides new recruits introduction. Academy removes recruits whose performance is unsatisfactory. Yeah, so basically this is your first initial foray into the topic. Training. And so we've been talking about this a little bit. So yes, there are some trainings that are standard that you'll have repeatedly. One that's kind of been coming to the forefront is that de-escalation stuff. That's been because of all of the high profile stuff in the media focused on de-escalation. And be like telling you, it's like how many different training schedules are there for de-escalations? Even the FBI has its own kind of thing. That's like 40 hours in terms of what it is in total. It's like, yeah, it would take care of your in-service training for that year, but that's a lot of training to be able to do that kind of stuff. Yeah. Talks about de-escalation.
Yes, this is
Ooh. This.
the escalation training that we're required to do. That's also clean.
Yeah.
It's got clean hours. It tells you how many hours we've done.
Very cool. That's awesome. Very cool. Yeah. Very useful stuff. It's one of those things that basically I've not gotten nearly enough into it, but anytime I think of de-escalation, I think of, the worst thing to say, please calm down. It's like, yeah, don't do that. That's not how you do it. Okay, next up talks about tactical decision making. Distance plus cover equals time. That's also, they call that reactionary gap. You can use that for any type of fighting. It's space is time, time is reaction, that kind of thing. That would keep you safe to some degree. Yeah, you keep safe from attack. That's actually the person who says time allows officers to communicate, expects information, make tactical plan, get resources, that kind of thing. Cover protects officers' safety. Yeah, I almost want to talk about concealment versus cover, right? Yeah, it's like your car is only concealment unless you're hugging certain parts, kind of thing, that kind of stuff. And so
It'd be like a bush is concealment, but a wall is cover.
yeah, depending on how thick the wall is.
That's true too.
Yeah. Like some walls, it's like this stuff. It's like that's not cover. That's just dust. It's like, yeah. You know, Mark talked about scenario-based training. That's actually some of the stuff that's getting really, really cool. So I remember seeing whenever it started out with like screen where you come in and be playing a screen and you have a little rubber gun kind of thing you get to interact with for some of those computerized trainings. Now it's full 3D, that kind of stuff. And that's going to become more common, that kind of stuff. What everybody's saying. All right. Engages in real world simulations. The funny, it's, we actually tried to get a grant here with Cherokee Nation last year, I think it was, for some de-escalation training related to using VR systems. It's like in the amount of technology that's available there, it's like you wouldn't actually believe it. Most people are familiar with VR, but this is the kind of stuff where it's like you can walk outside, take pictures of your environment, you can go back in. Next thing you know, that environment's been reproduced in that virtual reality, that kind of thing. And that kind of technology is going to become more and more available as time goes on. Yeah, something you want to say?
No, I was just
Okay.
gonna, I was gonna say that when I was in A school, being MP, like we actually had like one of the things that we had was, like you were saying, it was kind of like VR, but I mean, they had like, a real M9, which was the Beretta 92F that was hooked up to like a pneumatic system, and it ran off a computer program, but like they would put us in like shoot, don't shoot scenarios.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah, that's exactly the same kind of stuff here. I was very curious. They use some type of like air pressure to get there.
yeah, I mean, that was back in, 2008.
Yeah, that's cool. Those things are always fun. Oh, okay. So here's what I started talking about: police training and unconscious bias. Have I talked about this in here? Unconscious bias.
I don't think so.
Okay. I might have been in my methods class. I was talking about that because I talked about it somewhere within the last couple of weeks. This one's a problem. This one's a big problem. People don't see it as a problem that it is because they want to see something. To some degree, we want to be able to identify disparate treatment, especially if it's race-based, that kind of thing, or if it's sex-based, that kind of stuff, because it's something that is directly offensive. However, as society changes, most people don't speak honestly about that stuff anymore. So that's, I guess, both good and bad. You don't have to hear it, but then it's still there to some degree, which is not good. And so this is to some degree, I guess you'd say, higher education kind of coming in and trying to pull that out. Realize that anytime you're doing that, you're reaching into someone's mind, and that's not something that's easy to do. We do it in the legal system. It takes 12 people plus months and months of time, that kind of thing. And so this is not that. This is research. And so have a little bit of pause there because it's going to be something a little bit different. In this case, what they would do, the base research that started the implicit association, implicit bias, as the implicit association test, where it starts out with they'll be presenting people with a litany of pictures of people of different races and a series of words that they can identify to associate with that picture. And in doing that so many times across so many people who are actually taking the test, they were able to pull out some differences in terms of, racial biases that people weren't aware of. You start viewing certain races more favorably than others. It's like that is a bias. But is that one that is race-based exclusively? That's the problem. Because what you end up dealing with there is the difference between novelty and familiarity. That's why within race, identifications are more accurate than across race. There's some familiarity there, some novelty there. And we start interacting with things that people don't know, that opportunity for negativity starts to come. So with that, that's one of those things that's a big weakness for this that people aren't really talking about too much, because that's going to be one of those major philosophical underpinnings for that entire line of research that it's not addressed. That's not good. Here, it's like you can still play with it because even if you're not aware of it, if you have a bias, it's like that's still a bias, but it's not necessarily the same thing as what people would have it be. It's like that's not necessarily the same thing as racism. It can be racist though. FIP training in role playing scenarios. Yeah. So as you start getting into the training aspect of it, boom, post academy training. Here's where I start talking about field training officers. Let's see, we're going to assign 3 different FTOs for 4 week period, each followed by. That depends on the department, of course. You're going to be dealing with larger departments that do stuff like that, because otherwise you don't have the personnel for it. Keep in mind when you start dealing with most departments, they're very small in number. They're very small in number of employees. Each daily reports, the reports all over the place. In service training, we've already kind of talked about. Just gonna hit the basic stuff there. Refresher on changes in law enforcement recent court decisions. That's also a big thing right there that people sometimes think about, sometimes don't. If you had procedures, that's pretty heavily focused on law enforcement because about half the semester spent on Fourth Amendment issues. And with that, you can see how each major landmark case changes that issue and how we handle it. And those cases are still ongoing. There's always something going on in the court system. Okay.
Can I say something about the refresher
Yeah.
part of it?
Yeah.
I actually had a teacher who, a former professor, that she had a really strong background in social work. She had worked with domestic violence intervention services, and she
Yeah.
got her PhD in some interesting stuff. But she had said one of the biggest issues that she encountered when she was working with domestic violence intervention services, she was a liaison that basically went to court on behalf of supporters, the women in the cases. And she said, you don't think about this when you're in college, but one of the biggest issues is that she said she encountered is a lot of the cases got dismissed because a lot of the judges were older white males and they had went to college maybe 30 years, 20 years prior, and they had been sitting on the bench that long. And when they went to college, they actually were not required to take any social work classes, now we have speech classes that people have to take for prerequisites. So just imagine someone who went to college, probably went to law school, and did not study one class that may have been social work based. And she said often she just saw the cases get dismissed because the judges had not even experienced or had no understanding of some of the situation the women were going through because of how long they had been sitting on the bench.
Yeah. And that's one of those things that's really interesting because it's like,
That's very good to point out. I didn't even think about that.
well, it's really interesting because that's one. It's like people don't realize how much of a societal change took place and how short of a time period.
Yeah.
It's like that's one lifetime, and it's really even shorter than that. But you want to get into, when you really get into it, is this right here. It's the Violence Against Women Act of 1994. It's like that's not that long ago. If you start looking at what this thing did, all way outside of where I was thinking. But that's what you start tapping into is the same culture element that's reflected here. So this is going to be one that starts to recognize women's roles in domestic relationships and opens up opportunities to, of course, bring the police in to deal with domestics, and there's some other issues there. But if you look at this, and then if you look at domestic violence cases that were handled in well, basically in this time frame, any time from really like the 1980s to like 90s, you can actually find cases that are usually what they're related to are related to protection, that service of protection and legal liabilities associated with that. But what you'll see in those cases where they give you the details is you'll see that element reflected across society in the 80s and 90s, across judges, across police officers themselves, and that kind of thing. And it's really interesting because I forget where I was at when we were having this conversation. This was one that came up, and that was the exact inversion of I know where it was. I was having this different person on a different campus I was having a conversation with. So in the 1980s, what you'd see is this kind of thing. What did you do? You come in, you got a victimization. The first thing you hear is, "What did you do to deserve that?" Right? In the 1980s, it was. I could give you a number of cases where you can literally see that like directly quoted. Balstraver specific is the first one that comes to mind. There's a bunch of them. There's one that's got the name of here. I remember correctly. That one's really atrocious. Right? And so that's a really, really bad way to handle it. Right? Come in there with that kind of a thing, because that's almost like a justification / accusation / responsibility thing. That right there, it's like it's one of those pendulum things for trying to find that balance. And this is one where society started to go the opposite direction sometimes, where if you see domestic violence that's Right, because back then it was male to female. Now you can actually find a female to male where it's like you'll have officers come in. What did you do to deserve that? Ooh, that's also not a good way to handle it. So that middle ground is what we need to be at, where there's no accusations there, that kind of a thing. And then you start dealing with the officers on hand or the judicial system says you are dealing with, to some degree, history, because you're gonna have people who've taken decades to get there, that kind of thing. So it is always a slow moving thing, but realize that this time frame is only 3 decades. Right. That's not anything. It's like I remember seeing let's see, 94. Would that have been the year that I think that would have been the year Bill Clinton was elected. Well, actually formally took it over as president, I think. It's like that's not very many people ago. Time moves very fast in some ways. This is one where it's made some major changes. And so it's a really good thing. That social work element is a great big part of it. And it actually taps back in the thing we were talking about earlier, where it mentions the whole crime fighter versus servant, that kind of thing. That's the element that they're talking about, is the historical way that you look at it is you're going to have to stop people doing bad things. It does that, but also that element that those people doing bad things are people too. That's the element that gets lost. All right. You'll train officers in service training, early intervention systems. This is for basically if you start seeing any signals that there might be problems. It's like the any number of ways that you can be flagged for having problems like the use of force. That kind of stuff's pretty easy to clarify. But if you start, depending on what these systems are, where they set those thresholds related to what, you can do that pretty easily. That's going to be tied in the computer system. What SWIFT talks about, I don't remember. Basically, it's if we track how many incidents you're involved in, their outcomes, their any disputes, that kind of stuff, it's pretty easy to identify those types of things. Yeah, that's just intervention. So that way you can get to it before that they're a big problem, but that's not always what happens. Post academy training, post shooting incidents, returning to duty. Yeah, anytime there's anything, well, shooting, of course, but there's a lot of different types of incidences where there has to be some like investigations, that kind of stuff. That's going to have some effects there, but they'll want to evaluate you to make sure you're okay to return back to the job. Special training for new responsibilities. There, it gives you some of those things right there. Basically, what they start talking about there is anytime you have any type of specialized unit or anything like that, any specialized efforts that are getting ready to come through. As those types of groups are put together, they'll tap certain people and look to bring in certain skills, that kind of thing. Okay. Here's where it talks a little bit about some issues with training. Basically, what you get here is that defragment or fragment. It's a decentralized system. As many different places there are that do training, there's different people who teach it differently. Every time you get it, it's a little bit different. My favorite one's that last bullet right there. Conflicting training on the same issue. Yes, remember our system's one where you have to manage what works and what doesn't. So you have to keep track of both of those things simultaneously, trying to find that middle ground. Not an easy thing to do. And then if you don't have adequate training, it says legal consequences. We'll stop there with that. Basically what that is if there's any area that you should know that there needs to be training on, you have a reasonable expectation to know that training is needed. If you don't provide it properly, it's not just the officer or whoever's involved in that situation who's liable. That's the whole organization itself. That's where you get the big ticket lawsuits. That's where that stuff comes in. And with that, we'll pick up next class. You guys have any questions or need anything?
Just if you were able to grade those assignments over the weekend.
Oh, I was not. I was able to get some other stuff done, but not that one. Got videos up. Grading will be coming soon. Hoping that get some time between classes today, probably around noon.
Okay.
Schedule's been rough. But I overslept today, so I missed my first class. So I'm feeling bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, I guess. That's not good either. Yeah. All right. So we'll pick up with that next class. So move into probationary periods. We should, yeah, that's literally the last part of this one. And then we'll move into the next chapter. All right. With that, where is my and share? All right. Cool, cool, cool. Well, with that, I will catch you all next time. You have a great day. Bye.